السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. النهاردة COVID-19 pandemic began last year in Wuhan in central China, but has since grown to affect every country on the earth, with more than 33 million cases and nearly 1 million deaths worldwide. Egyptian scientists, as many researchers worldwide, worked hard to unravel the mysteries around COVID-19. And now we are honored to have eminent Egyptian scientists to show some of the Egyptian studies done in this context.
My name is Imam Wakid. I'm honored to share this session together with Professor Dina Atiyah, Professor Adil Hassan, and to introduce several of the most eminent Egyptian researchers who published research on COVID-19. I first would like to thank Professor Dalia Omran for coordinating the session, and Professor Ahmed Kurdi for his organization throughout the meeting. And it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Antoine Abdelmasih. He's the first speaker. Dr. Abdelmasih is a lecturer of pediatrics and pediatric cardiology in Cairo University. He worked on vascular tropism of COVID-19, and we know now that vascular tropism is one of the main causes of complications and death in COVID-19. And this breakthrough in knowledge has resulted in therapeutic measures that saved a lot of lives. He published several papers on the vascular tropism of COVID-19 together with a group of researchers and young researchers. And he also published on COVID-19 and obesity, which is a very interesting correlation. And we are all looking forward to hearing his first talk on vascular tropism of COVID-19. So,
thank you, sir, for your presentation, and thank you all for coordinating this session. And thank you, Cody, for inviting me. I will share now my presentation. Vascular tropism and COVID-19 mechanisms and implications. First of all, we all know that COVID-19 started in Wuhan in November 2019. It was declared as a pandemic in the 22nd of March. There were 3 similar previous outbreaks by other coronaviridi, namely SARS-1, which occurred in 2002, Hong Kong coronaviridi, which occurred in 2004, and MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which occurred in 2006. And the first 2 outbreaks mainly occurred in China and Hong Kong, while the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome occurred in Saudi Arabia. To date, there are more than 8 million cases, more than 400,000 deaths, and even jumping in few days to 800 to 900. What is different between COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 and the other former outbreaks, SARS-CoV-1 and MERS-CoV? The higher capability to spread, the multi-organ involvement, and what lies behind the multi-organ involvement, which is the topic of our presentation or our talk, the vascular phenomena in the affected organs. What made us think that COVID-19 affects the organs by vascular dysfunction is, first of all, a clinical evidence. There are many clinical evidences that point out that COVID-19 affects vessels in the putative organs. One of them is the lung involvement, the pattern of lung involvement. There is evidence that the pattern of lung involvement is mainly interstitial in the area highly supplied by blood vessels, rather than the alveolar spaces. Also, the hematological manifestations. There is evidence, either post-mortem or from cases, that there is prothrombotic state in COVID-19 with endotheliitis present in the post-mortem samples. Also, there are other organs that are affected with a pattern similar to vascular involvement or mimicking vascular involvement. Namely, in the CNS, there is acute hemorrhagic encephalopathy, which mimics the acute disseminated encephalomyelitis that occurs in pediatric age group due to vascular involvement and due to vasculitis. And also in the reproductive system, there is massive involvement of the Leydig cells of the testis, which is highly susceptible to vascular involvement. I end the clinical evidence with an important point, which is how the myocardium is affected. There are many cases with COVID-19 that showed elevation of the highly specific troponins, which made people think that it is affected by direct myocardial invasion by SARS-CoV-2. While actually many post-mortem biopsies failed to isolate the virus from the cardiomyocytes, but it was heavily present in the interstitial tissue and also in the coronary endothelium, which point out that the SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 targets even the myocardium by coronary hypoperfusion and by inducing a state of cardiac ischemia. This is another clinical evidence that COVID-19 targets the organs by vascular involvement rather than by direct damage. Another important evidence about the relationship of vessels and vascular inflammation to COVID-19 is the very interesting relationship between COVID-19 and Kawasaki. In March 2022, or before March 2022, the disease was deemed, COVID-19 was deemed very, very trivial in children until there were several alerts from governments like Como in New York and like in the Royal College of Pediatric and Child Health in UK, that there is an outbreak or an abnormal increase of cases mimicking Kawasaki disease. We all know that Kawasaki disease is a middle vessel vasculitis, which affects mainly children. And to avoid the overlap, they named the new syndrome pediatric multi-inflammatory syndrome. Why there is an important relationship between Kawasaki and COVID-19? There are many relationships between coronaviridi and Kawasaki. First of all, coronaviridi has been implicated in the past in the induction of multiple post-infectious vasculitis like Henneschen-Lyon purpura, acute hemorrhagic edema, and Kawasaki disease. Also, they both used, both diseases, Kawasaki disease and COVID-19, they both use the main pathways of cytokines, human necrosis factor, transforming growth factor beta, interleukin-2, and most important of them, interleukin-6. Why is SARS-CoV-2 specifically targeting the blood vessels? We were exploring the clinical evidence. Now we want to explore the pathogenetic mechanisms. There are three main points that make SARS-CoV-2 mainly targeting the vascular endothelium. First of all, the interleukin-6. Second, AC2 receptors. And a third molecule that is extremely important and underexplored, which is furin. We all know that COVID-19 causes a state of immune dysregulation. It causes upregulation of pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-6, and it causes downregulation of regulatory cytokines such as type 1 interferon. The upregulation of pro-inflammatory cytokines, mainly interleukin-6 and transforming growth factor beta, has been found to target mainly the vascular endothelium because interleukin-6 has a high affinity to vascular endothelium, which explains why the vascular endothelium is highly susceptible to the manifestations of COVID-19. A second thing is the AC2 receptors. AC2 receptors are the target receptors for the cellular entry of SARS-CoV-2. And therefore, the tissues with higher AC2 receptors are thought to be more affected by COVID-19. It was thought in the beginning that SARS-CoV-2 targets mainly the lung because the lung is heavily flooded with AC2 receptors. Furin also is an important proteolytic enzyme that cleaves some viruses like HIV, like SARS-CoV-2, like in some pathogenic strains of influenza inside the cells and promotes their activation and promotes their pathogenic activity. So those two molecules are mainly implicated in the pathogenesis and in the higher manifestations of COVID-19 if they are heavily present in some tissues. A single sequencing study that was done by us recently and that appeared on PubMed showed that, again, is the false fixed belief, the lungs do not show many receptors of furin and of ACE2. Unlikely, the endothelium was the highest tissue to express both ACE2 receptors and furin, both at the level of mRNA, and both at the level of proteins, which means that the endothelium is the tissue that should be mostly affected because it harbors the ACE2 receptors, which facilitates the cellular entry of SARS-CoV-2, and furin, which activates SARS-CoV-2. And this is very important to use those two molecules as therapeutic targets for decreasing the complications of COVID-19. I end with some implications on treatment. First implication, which I will not take long in discussing it because there will be other lectures about drug repurposing, is the blood thinners. We all know that patients hospitalized with COVID-19 and patients who required ICU admission with COVID-19 were all prescribed, because of the prothrombosis they have, blood thinners, ranging from antiplatelet medications to warfarin and low molecular heparin, reaching heparin. But what I want to, also, we all know that anti-interleukin-6, tocilizumab, was used in many patients with high success rate in decreasing the ICU morbidity and mortality. But there are two underexplored or overlooked therapeutic targets, mainly furin inhibition and ACE1 receptor blockers or angiotensin receptor blockers as well. Let's start with furin. As we said, furin is involved in the activation of SARS-CoV-2. And furin inhibition was explored in different types of viruses like HIV to decrease the manifestations of HIV in the most susceptible groups. How to inhibit furin? Furin cellular levels is inversely proportional to the level of intracellular cations, mainly potassium and calcium. And therefore, using potassium channel blockers and calcium channel blockers, potassium channel blockers like the famous amiodarone and dromedrone, and calcium channel blockers like amlodipine, like the antihypertensive such as amlodipine, might decrease the severity of manifestations of COVID-19 in the most susceptible groups. This is why many reports have reported that patients on some antihypertensives, especially on calcium channel blockers, have decreased severity of COVID-19 manifestations. Then I want to explore the effect of COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 on ACE2 receptors. When SARS-CoV-2 enters the cells through ACE2 receptors, it causes knockout of the ACE2 receptors. It causes a decreased level of ACE2 receptors. ACE2 receptors plays an important role in prevention of vascular degeneration and vascular inflammation. It is vasoprotective. And therefore, restoring the level of ACE2 receptors by ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers might also decrease the vascular degeneration and vascular inflammation involved in COVID-19. This is why in the beginning of the pandemic, there were rumors that because ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers increases ACE2, it might increase the cellular entry of SARS-CoV-2. And some people said that people on ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers should stop it. After that, the European Society of Cardiology, the ESC, released other data or contradicting data that said that use of ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers is encouraged because it doesn't affect the cellular entry, but it rather provides vascular protection against the worst manifestations of COVID-19. Another point that I wanted to point out is that we released lately an important research about the transplacental transmission of COVID-19, where we outlined that transplacental transmission is unlikely, but placental damage, because it's a vascular organ with high concentration of furin, is very likely. So we encourage OB/GYN doctors from all the world to be aware that there are some guidelines about use of anticoagulants in blood thinners in pregnant women affected with COVID-19 to avoid placental damage and to avoid subsequent fetal hypoxia. I wanted finally to thank all my co-authors in the pictures. Some of them are Cairo University students, some of them are New Giza students, ranging from medical students and pharmacy students and dentistry students. I wanted to thank Pixagon Agency for designing the figures I used in the presentation and in the researches. If anyone is interested to follow the researches we have done on COVID-19, you can scan the QR code. These are parts of the researches we have done. I wanted to thank my family, the crew of Pediatrics and Pediatric Cardiology, Cairo University, and Dr. Kurdi for inviting me in this conference. Thank you all, and I am open to any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Antoine, for the very interesting presentation. I'd like to ask Dr. Dina Ismail to present the next speaker, Dr. Ahmed Kurdi, and we will keep the questions till the end of the session.
Okay.